Thank you very much indeed, Wendy, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Haiti is the single disaster which posed the biggest challenge, I think, to me, but also to the system during my time as the Emergency Relief Coordinator. That's obviously not really comparing it with the ongoing crises in Darfur or Congo or wherever, which are a different sort of challenge. But in terms of the natural disaster, despite Cyclone Nargis and so on, this is the one which I think had the most intensive efforts in terms of coordination and operational issues which we put in, although of course it has probably now been overtaken in that category by the massive Pakistan floods which were just starting when I left. And it's also, as you're all aware, a crisis which is by no means over, as we've seen very sadly from the latest outbreak of cholera in the Artibonite region. And even if that's brought quickly under control, as I profoundly hope it will be, this will remain a humanitarian crisis well into 2011, in fact probably for most of 2011, as we always feared and anticipated it would be. And I think it's a fact of life, and I'm not making any criticism here, that the recovery and reconstruction effort is also going very slowly for all sorts of reasons. So in that context, I think it's right that we should look very hard at what we did right, what we got wrong, and not only try to draw the lessons from our experiences in Haiti, but make sure, if we can, that we apply them next time. That was the idea behind the Interagency Standing Committee report, which we produced after 6 months, to look at what we got right and what we got wrong. And of course, there was also a real-time evaluation, and I recommend both of them to you because they're very good reading and have a lot of good detail in them. But the point is we need to follow them up, not just write them and then put them on the shelf and forget about them for next time. But just two caveats to that point about following them up. First of all, some of the issues which arose in Haiti are very Haiti-specific. And so we should be wary about drawing inappropriate lessons from Haiti, which are not really applicable elsewhere. So that's why we need to distinguish carefully between those lessons or those problems which are Haiti-specific and those which are of more general application. And secondly, there's sometimes, I think, a rather glib narrative about how, well, anybody really, but including the humanitarian community, doesn't learn lessons, or at least doesn't seem to apply them in practice. Now, that is partly true, and there's a real problem there. I don't want to deny that. But sometimes when things that seem very obvious to analysts don't happen, it's because there are really strong reasons why they don't happen, or at least strong problems behind that. I mean, we look, for example, why do we never seem to get early recovery right? It's not because successive generations of humanitarian or development actors are all stupid or incompetent, but simply because there are some fundamental factors at play there which mean it's very hard to get right and very hard to change current attitudes and institutions. Similarly, why do we never seem to learn the lesson, and this is one of the ones I'm sure we'll talk about involving local communities more, involving local actors more, being more sensitive to local concerns? I think partly it's because we have to recognize that in the inevitable chaos and urgency of any major natural disaster like this, it's just much harder to do in practice than it seems obvious to people coming from the outside that you should do. So we need to recognize that at the same time as recognizing that we need to do better. I don't want to go through all the sort of circumstances which you're all pretty well aware of, I guess, about the Haiti earthquake and some of the big difficulties we encountered, not only in the early stages, but of course some of these problems are still there now. But let me just single out a few of the key issues for the background, because I think they are important to understanding it. First of all, as you're all aware, this happened in a highly impoverished and dysfunctional city, in a highly impoverished and dysfunctional society with a highly dysfunctional government, and an international aid effort which had arguably gone about trying to overcome some of those problems in a mislead or a wrong, if understandable way, by bypassing that government. That's the whole issues of the Republic of NGOs. Secondly, the earthquake hit very hard all the normal services and institutions and actors who might have been best placed to respond more quickly and better. And of course that included the UN, the NGOs and the emergency services, all of which were badly affected, lost people, decapitated and so on. Thirdly, it took place largely in an extremely crowded and complex urban environment where lack of land, lack of clarity about who owned and controlled land, and intense rivalries between central and local authorities about land and the future of land, and of course the private landowners themselves, bedevil relief efforts right from the start and continue to do so. And fourthly, it was one of those disasters which instantly became a massive media and public disaster. For example, completely unlike Pakistan, which was, as I say, arguably much bigger despite the lower death toll. Well, there's a good side to that, obviously. It's your ability to raise lots of money quickly. Every country in the world was holding telethons. It was on the media screens 24/7 in some cases. Also, you had very quick arrival of military forces in the US and Canada and elsewhere to reinforce MINUSTA and provide capacities and capabilities which were not going to be there otherwise. But it has a less good side too. It means that you have on the ground very quickly an even greater multiplicity of actors than usual. The military again, there's good and bad there. The donors, they're in force, each with their own ideas. And of course a mass of NGOs, some of whom are not particularly familiar with these circumstances. And that, plus the intense and I would argue sometimes unfair media scrutiny, made coordination and progress even more difficult than it might have been otherwise. And none of these four things I've singled out, and there are others too you could mention, are hugely difficult necessarily in themselves. All crises have their major problems and their very difficult circumstances, but it was a combination, I think, of all these four in Haiti and some others that made progress on every front seem very slow, difficult, and often very painful. And that led to a lot of discussion about who was in charge, who was actually coordinating. And there's a myth there that the US military were keen to lead the relief effort. That's not true. They were always very concerned not to be seen to be leading the relief effort because they could see where that might lead them into all the criticism. But they and everybody else wanted to see strong international leadership while at the same time respecting the need to allow the government to be, or at least to appear to be, in the charge and in the lead themselves. So there were a lot of issues around that, which took up a lot of time at that early stage. Did we get the leadership right without going into personalities and so on? No, I didn't think we did, for a lot of very complicated reasons, although I don't think we got it as wrong as some people suggested either. Certainly I never believed the US view that somehow there could be some person, big person could come in from the outside, solve all the problems and cut through all the bureaucracy. What we needed were good teams, strong presences, all-round efforts, and it took some time to assemble them. It took some time to make sure that the leaders we did have on the ground had the support that they needed, including the humanitarian coordinator. I'm sure you've all seen from the various publications the list of what, on the whole, when I say we, I mean the whole international community got right broadly, if sometimes more slowly than we wanted and with some hiccups on the way. I think we did well on the search and rescue front, under coordination of that, although we also ought to remember that most of the rescues were carried out by the local people themselves. Most relief efforts were done by people before any international actors got there. I think we did well on the immediate medical care front, and not badly on post-operative care, and disease control, of course, at least until the latest cholera outbreak. I think that was another success. I think water, the provision of water was a success in very difficult circumstances, and food assistance too, although that was very difficult, and I always took as illustrative of the problems in Haiti that even the World Food Programme, who were whatever else you might think of them, are very good logistically and very good at organising food quickly, struggled for a couple of weeks on how best to tackle this at all before they started to get it right. Areas where I think we did reasonably well, especially over time: education, emergency education, to some extent agriculture, livelihoods. Cash for work was an important element of what we were doing in the early stages, although arguably we never did enough of that, but it's a very expensive way of doing things. Where did we struggle, and where are we in some cases still struggling? Needs assessment, the efforts we made there at the beginning, we had great hopes for that, but it was a great disappointment. Shelter, I think everybody's aware, was the biggest single challenge in many ways. We were very slow for all sorts of reasons on emergency shelter, but of course transitional shelter, resettlement are still massive issues because of the land and land tenure problems that I referred to earlier. And also some really difficult questions about what the authorities, whether they be local or central, really want to happen Do they really want to move people out of Port-au-Prince? Do they really want to decentralize? Those questions are still actually, to a large extent, unresolved, and that makes it much more difficult to plan what you're going to do with people when you get them out of the very unsatisfactory camps they're in. Camp management, I think it was the right decision at an early stage not to go for big camps outside Port-au-Prince, despite the ease of organising them in some respects. But the result has been, of course, a huge number of so-called spontaneous settlements, 1,300, 1,500, whatever the right number is, many often in vulnerable, very dangerous places. But it means the challenge of managing those camps, finding enough organisations, NGOs, despite the number of NGOs you have around in some ways, to run those camps has been a real problem. Protection has not been a strong point, I think, particularly against gender-based violence. Lots of issues there in many of the camps, as I'm sure many of you are aware. But again, I would say we need to be a little bit careful about that. These are issues which go beyond the camps. They're issues which were there before the earthquake happened and will be there after the earthquake recovery is completed. So there are systemic problems which we need to remember as well. And one issue perhaps on the UNHCR front, on the protection front, which affected some of the other areas I've mentioned too, is that UNHCR are not really present in this crisis. This is a natural disaster. UNHCR were not present on the ground. They were not at that stage gone as far as they perhaps have now in accepting a protection role in natural disasters. And I think that was an aggravating factor for some of the failures there. Sanitation, another big area of difficulty. Lack of space, again, caused huge problems. But again, we have to remember that sanitation problems were enormous in Haiti even before the earthquake. A few other thoughts. How did the sort of elements of humanitarian reform perform in Haiti? I think the fact that we had up and running quickly the cluster system, reactivated it because it had existed before after the hurricanes of 2008, that was essential in getting some things moving. And I think brought out the value of the clusters, but it also brought out some of their weaknesses. Where were the lead agencies really wanting to put their resources into their own operations or into cluster leadership? And the answer very often was into their own operations and not into cluster leadership. So that had to be rebalanced, and was to some extent. There was a lack of resources going into cluster leadership, cluster coordination, including, incidentally, on intercluster coordination, which is a responsibility of OCHA. A lack of information management capacity for the clusters, which meant that information didn't flow in the ways that it should, and problems of leadership, which were definitely there. But still, I think on the whole, the clusters proved their value, even if the experience also showed some of the weaknesses. On the humanitarian coordination side, the local humanitarian coordinator, I talked a little bit about this leadership issue. There was a constant battle whether there should have been a separate resident coordinator doing the development side and a separate humanitarian coordinator. This is a wider issue, as many of you will be aware. Whether we should split them because clearly the challenges were too much for any one person, or keep them together because that was the best way of ensuring synergy between humanitarian response and recovery. And that's a discussion which was resolved in the end in favour of having one person, but a lot of effort was wasted in the process of arguing about it. And of course that argument, as I say, in the wider context is set to go on. On the financial side, I think the Central Emergency Response Fund and the local pool fund, the Emergency Response Fund for Haiti, worked very well. The flash appeal was very quick and effective, if also very rough, if we're honest about it. But we did run into the problem, which I think we'll run into elsewhere too, of a kind of wall where at a certain point the donors switch their attention to reconstruction and money for humanitarian response simply dries up. So I think there are likely to be increasing financial problems in financing the humanitarian response as we go on. A few of the other issues, lack of local involvement I mentioned. It was a real problem from the start, and it was actually recognised almost from the start, but it proved difficult to do as much about it as anybody really wanted. There were these problems about language. The response was too Anglophone. The people who turned up were too Anglophone, but that's a general humanitarian issue. There aren't enough Francophones around for some reason. A lot of people were robbing Peter to pay Paul around the world from West Africa to get Francophones in there. But a lot of the coordination was done in English, particularly at the beginning. And a lot of it was done inside the UN log space, which was not accessible or readily accessible to local actors. And that helped to isolate the international community from the local community, led to resentment from the local community, and led to some real problems and probably a response which was not as good as it might have been otherwise. But as I suggested at the beginning, I think there was something more fundamental here about how difficult that is certainly in the first weeks of a response, when you're simply focusing on getting stuff out of the door and stopping people from dying. It's sometimes difficult to, no matter how much training you've had in this, to involve local civil society as much as you would like, and there is always the attitude that they are helpless victims and not actors themselves, which has to be overcome. And another issue there actually was the question of security. There are a lot of stories, a lot of fears, I should say, about what might happen in a place supposedly as prone to violence as Haiti. That made people, or the rules, very rigid, the UN rules at least, very rigid about who could do what. And I think that also reinforced this sense of isolation, even though most of those fears proved pretty misplaced in the end. And actually there was a lot more looting in Chile, supposedly a much more developed country than there ever was in Haiti. Second issue, how to integrate the military actors and, of course, some of the major donors who, as I said, were there in force. There was a lot of good improvisation in setting up some structures which worked reasonably well. But it also did reveal that the basic humanitarian architecture, which has been devised over the years and which functions reasonably well in many ways, does not include really or allow for these actors in the way that it should do. And there's a more general point there about the military actors, particularly in natural disaster situations where it's not so complicated. There's no point having our heads in the sand about this. They are there. They will be there for most natural disasters. They will be very important actors. So we need to get on with them. And we need to have all these, the civil military coordination structure set up, and the principles set up in advance, and not try and improvise on the ground because it gets too difficult. Thirdly, the massive NGOs who turned up, rather on the model of the tsunami in 2004-05. Let's recognise this is not usually a problem. Very often the problem is not enough NGOs, not too many. But some circumstances like this one, where it's a very media-driven disaster, an awful lot of organisations turn up, and the task of coordination becomes, of course, extremely difficult. I think the health cluster had something like 400 organisations trying to attend its meetings at one stage, which is obviously extremely hard to manage. I think there's an issue to be looked at here. It's not a new one. Some system of self-certification of those who should be empowered, as it were, to turn up at disasters like this needs to be looked at. I'll come back to that very briefly at the end. Fourth issue is this question of how to manage disasters in urban situations. It's a fact that the humanitarian community is much more used to dealing with problems, conflict, victims and so on in rural areas. And therefore the problems which are caused by lack of space, congestion, waste disposal issues, the impossibility of distinguishing, for example in Haiti, the earthquake victims from the rest of the population, which we saw in Kenya incidentally a couple of years before. People even moving into the camps because they're likely to get more services there than they might have done otherwise. All these problems were there. All of them we were not very familiar with, not very good at managing, so there's a real issue there which we need to, I think, to study more and to get better at, including a very basic problem which has bedeviled the operation from the beginning and still is, which is rubble removal. It sounds simple, it's not, and we haven't managed it properly yet. And the biggest question in all this, there's a lot of detailed points there and one could discuss them at much bigger length, but the biggest question is, does Haiti, followed by the Pakistan floods, tell us that, or does the response to these disasters tell us that the humanitarian model is broken and needs to be looked at again in a more fundamental way? Now, I don't have a simple answer to that, but let me just give you a few reflections on it. I think the challenges are going to get bigger in the future from these natural disasters because of climate change, because of urbanization, and so on. So we need to be readier than we clearly were before these two major ones to deal with them. And if we think about what might happen in a major earthquake in Kathmandu, which could be even worse than Port-au-Prince, then we can see that why we need to do that. Secondly, actually in Haiti we did get most of the basics right in terms of saving lives, which is after all the basic thing we're trying to do, so we shouldn't undervalue that. The system has improved a lot over the years, and I think it continues to do so. Personally, I'm a believer in incremental change, evolution, not revolution. I'm not sure it's a good idea to pull out the sort of humanitarian reform plant to look at its roots to see if it's growing properly. I think that might be more counterproductive than anything else. And certainly I don't think there's a magic fix for this. Of course, the system is not a system, as we all know. It's not what you design with a blank sheet of paper. It is very fragmented. It's fragmented on the UN side with overlapping mandates, but even more so on the NGO side, with the Red Cross family in there as well. But certainly when I first started as the Emergency Relief Coordinator in 2007, I looked at this and decided that was too big a challenge to take on, to try and consolidate and amalgamate the sector. You could spend a lot of time and get absolutely nowhere on it. So there's a fundamental problem there. It, of course, has the advantage of diversity. We have lots of diversity, but it's also fragmented. I'm not convinced so far by different suggestions that have been made for some kind of new set-up, standing force. There's the French idea for red helmets. There's a Qatari-sponsored idea called Hope For. The idea of having some sort of civil defense or military assets which are ready to go in and take charge at the beginning of these crises. My suspicion is that will simply result in more duplication and more actors and not less simplification. In any case, I think that's a debate which will continue and should continue, and of course Ross will be looking at the British angle of it as part of the humanitarian response review which DFID have asked for. Meanwhile, just to finish up, and I'm sorry if I've taken too long, some basics I think we could do better, irrespective of whether we want to have a more fundamental look at the system. Firstly, we do need to have a clearer idea about some of these leadership issues in disasters like this. We need to probably agree in advance how we will deal with that, what sort of arrangement we will make, rather than try to sort it out at the time, which becomes extremely difficult. Secondly, obviously, we do need to strengthen further coordination. You won't be surprised if I say that we should have a better funded OCHA. That's a biased view, no doubt, but I think it's true that if we're asking more and more from an organisation like that, it needs to be funded accordingly. Thirdly, and these are in no particular order, I should say, one of the things that struck me about Haiti, and I think it was true of Pakistan too, is that the world lacks stockpiles of some essential goods, particularly things like shelter materials, which are very hard to find and purchase and transport. That problem was supposed to have been fixed after the tsunami. I don't think it was. Fourthly, the early recovery link. As I said before, this is a very difficult area, but we still need to work further on getting it right. There's no simple answer again. We did make big efforts to make sure that the humanitarian angle was factored into the post-disaster needs assessment process, but I think we would all agree that it didn't work as well as we would have liked it to. Fifthly, we do need to invest more in the cluster system. The agencies, the lead agencies, whoever they may be, need to invest more in this and regard it as more central to their operations rather than something they're doing on the side. Sixthly, civil military coordination. For the reasons I've given, we need to invest more in that. Needs assessment. There's a lot of work underway in the system, but that needs to be completed so we've got better methods of collective common needs assessment, better information early on. Then we need, I think, to involve the donors more in our systems, as I suggested. And of course, the donors need to get better at coordinating amongst themselves. One of the things that donors are very good is telling the rest of the system to coordinate. One of the things they're very bad at is coordinating amongst themselves. So I think we should work on that. And that includes an issue which I haven't mentioned but is interesting. And again, it goes back to the tsunami. And the same was happening in Pakistan, which is of many countries insisting on sending plane loads of goods which are not wanted and are very often useless, simply because of the public demands that they should do something. Cash is best, which sounds very self-interested coming from humanitarian organisations, but I think it's no more than the truth. The NGO issue, again, I think there has to be more efforts. I mean, it has to be led by the NGOs themselves. No one can impose this upon them about specialisation, better coordination amongst themselves, certification, maybe even amalgamation in some cases. because when you have a disaster like this, there are simply too many organisations trying to do the same thing, even if sometimes you don't have enough real capacity on the ground. Finally, and these are not trivial points, they're actually the most important points in some ways, we do need to do a lot more on building local capacity, even in places like Haiti, so they're not so dependent on the outside response. And we do need to do a lot more on disaster risk reduction. Haiti is the sort of poster child, or the classic case of total failure of disaster risk reduction, with a very, very vulnerable community. People should not be left as vulnerable to a disaster again as they were in Port-au-Prince. But unfortunately, the reality is, for the moment, they are just as vulnerable as they were before, if not more so. We need to do something about that while we're doing everything else. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sir John.